All right. What's going on, Peter? How you doing?
I'm good, Travis. Thanks for having me on. This is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, hell yeah, man. This will be fun. Dude, the story that you're telling is awesome. Never even had no idea this even existed, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of been lost to time. I mean, it's 1980, Riverside. So you're in Los Angeles area, aren't you?
Yeah, Long
Yeah, so
Beach.
you got some familiarity with Riverside, but yeah, back then there was no no ubiquitous cell phone cameras, no 24-hour news channels to loop it around, no internet to post it on, so it kind of got lost to time, even though it's a really a remarkable event.
Yeah, interesting. And can we officially say that, LA Riverside area was the bank robbery capital of the world?
Yeah, you can absolutely say that. It's kind of lost its throne lately, but for decades, Los Angeles was the bank robbery capital of the world. One out of four bank robberies committed in the United States happened within the jurisdiction of the LA field office of the FBI. And which is the greater metropolitan Los Angeles area, and it just outpaced any other crime statistics. Los Angeles not up there, was not up there per capita in any major crimes. And but it was this and that started well before Norco, but really peaked out later on with the crack cocaine boom and everything else epidemic, and they lost their title in 2003, but they've it's every few years they get it back. But at its worst in 1992, there was 2,600 bank robberies in that area, and that's 14 a
Dude,
day. And the
that's
reason is free.
crazy.
The reason's freeways. It's because of
Yeah.
freeways. I mean, there's a lot of banks out there, and this car culture. But you can rob a bank near a freeway on ramp, hop on a freeway, and if you time it right, 5 minutes later, you're 5 miles away, and you're cruising the side street of some completely different police jurisdiction. So,
hmm
and plus, you know, LA, the LA retail banking industry got so competitive that and convenience is everything in Southern California. It's a home of fast food. It's a home of drive-through.
hmm
And so they started putting them closer and closer to freeways, even though they knew they just built it into the business plan. So soon you had it.
Yeah.
You just all of them. They try. So yeah, that's what caused it. And then in general, bank robberies went through the roof when cocaine first appeared in the disco era,
hmm
1975, and the whole celebrity culture and of Los Angeles and party culture pumped that up even beyond other cities. It was so flaunted. It was so, I mean, celebrities, whether they be porn stars or film stars or rock musicians, they were wearing Coke spoons around their neck, and it was became a status symbol. And when you get addicted to Coke and you start, running out of money, you need to get money fast. And bank robbery in Los Angeles was the way to do it. Um,
Dude, crazy.
yeah, I know. Well, those are mostly the guys who are addicts are mostly note passers. They're called one-on-one bandits. They come in, it's one bank robber, one bank teller, pass the note across. I got a gun. Give me all your money. Clean out a teller drawer for 2,500, $3,500. Walk out, hop on the freeway, get the hell out of there. And
hmm
you're probably going to get away with it, but eventually your luck's going to run out. And that's of course a very different motivation and a very different type of bank robbery than the Norco bank robbery. Uh, but
hmm
to answer your question, yeah, bank robbery capital of the world. It was the FBI who named it the bank robbery capital of the world. The um, the FBI field office in Los Angeles had it on coffee mugs
Yeah.
and on their fax cover sheets. It said bank robbery capital of the world.
Dude, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it is funny.
Man, what were they thinking? Were they like, was it just kind of like a little badge of honor or something? Or what were they? Do you have any
Yeah,
idea why? Or
Yeah, the guy who headed up the bank robbery division during the real epidemic, which kind of started right around Norco and then spread up through like 1997. You kind of bookend it with the North Hollywood shootout, which was that crazy, those two guys sitting in front of that bank with body armor on and a ferocious firefight, which everybody saw because there was helicopters floating above them filming it. But Bill Rader was the bank squad, head of the bank's robbery squad, and yeah, they're charged with investigating bank robbers, but they're not. No one was ever blaming them for this. They were catching bank robbers as well as you could, but
Yeah.
particularly with the technology. Technology later became just a huge force in slowing down this whole epidemic. But yeah, they weren't really getting blamed for it, and it's a little bit of an inside joke. They certainly weren't laughing about it on radio or television, but yeah, so.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Bit of a badge of honor, but also kind of some dark humor at what they were up against, which was incredible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too how you mentioned it quickly about how it was built into sort of the business model of banks where it wasn't, compared to what they may lose on a investment or something like that. I think I read in one of your articles, like the money they were generally losing from robberies was like nothing.
Yeah, it was even a big takeover robbery. $400,000. They could lose it on a bad loan, is what
Yeah.
Rader said. The FBI guy. He just said I could lose that on a bad loan. Um, what what became a real problem for them was when the street gangs started to get into the game, and they
Yeah.
learned that wow, we could make a ton of money on this, and they'd send in these OGs, these original gangsters, the older guys would send in these what they called them baby bandits, and these were like teens, and they'd send them in there and to rob these banks, and they'd sit off in a motel room, a few miles away, send these crazy kids in there, and they started shooting up the place. They call them indoor muggings, and that's when those guys, the banks, finally got on board and said, "We got to get serious about this," because there were they had an entire branch of employees quit after after some of these because they were just so awful. I mean, they're just these
Yeah.
kids firing guns into the ceiling, pistol whipping customers, pulling the wedding rings off of them.
Mm-hmm.
No, none of that gentleman bank robbery thing anymore. And they started getting lawsuits from customers and things like that. And so around 1992, the losses from lawsuits and employee trying to replace employees and a disability from employees exceeded those from fraud in
Man.
the banking industry. So that's when they started to say, okay, the business model, it's not working. But yeah, they built it. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't callous disregard necessarily, but it was absolute model.
Yeah. Well, and like mostly before kind of, the gangs and the teens and stuff kind of came in and did the stuff, it was pretty non-violent most of the time, right?
Most of the time, yeah.
Okay.
And again, 80% of them are these note passers, these one-on-ones.
Yeah.
You get the inside jobs, which just means someone in the bank is helping someone out, usually getting them through a security barrier that they wouldn't otherwise get through. You had your very rare and then soon non-existent tunnelers, or the guys who break in when the bank wasn't open, somehow getting
Yes.
the ball. Those are the kind of the mythical cat burglar types. They were not that prevalent, but there's some crazy ones that happened in Los Angeles. But really, it's those takeover robberies, and a takeover robbery is what it sounds like: a bunch of, usually more than one, always more than one, two, three,
Mm-hmm.
four, coming into the bank, and it's everybody down on the floor will blow your heads off, and then they clean out the teller line, they clean out the vault, they clean out the reserves, and they get out. And if they time it right, these people are taking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and those are the ones that scare the hell out of the FBI because the
Mm-hmm.
potential for violence, the potential for injury and death are tremendous. And they didn't make up a lot, but again, once those baby bandits got in there, the street gangs in LA got in there, they went from about 5% to up to about over 30% of all the bank robberies in like a span of like 2 years. Again, Norco's 1980, so it's well before this.
Mm-hmm.
But they've always been the most worrisome of all the bank robberies.
Yeah. And then what is the story of kind of how like the baby bandits and everything got involved? Because wasn't it one guy reporting on like the amount being stolen or something?
Yeah, well, it was one OG, one original gangster that was running these gangs, and he so it's a funny story, funny in again a dark sense, funny in a not
Yes.
funny sense,
Right.
because it got ugly. But this was a guy. He went by the nickname Casper, and he's a member of the Crips, maybe at Long Beach, if I remember correctly. But he had gotten the idea of he would get these kind of addicts and winos off the streets, and he would basically say, "You guys want to make a little cash? You want to make a few $100?" And he'd send them in for one-on-one robberies. He'd send them in. They'd go to the with a note to the teller, and they'd walk out with 25, 3,500 bucks. Casper would keep 95% of it and give the guys a couple hundreds. He was an intimidating guy, but he was making a pretty decent take on that. And
Yeah.
then came a bank robbery um, in Tarzana, California. I think it was the First Interstate Bank in Tarzana, California. And that was actually a takeover robbery that was pulled off by a very goofy group of guys. I mean, they were like the Norco guys. They were religious fanatics with, you know, unlike the Norco guys, they had more significant mental illness going on their side. But they were, foot soldiers of God in there to get money to do whatever the hell they thought they were going to do. But the point is, it was a takeover robbery. And these guys were the old school kind of almost gentleman robbers. They'd go in there, they'd apologize to everybody. They'd say, "Get down on the floor. You guys just, you know, be cool, we'll be out of here." And they'd even yell, "Thanks everyone," as they went out the door. Well, they took
Yeah.
$450,000. I think it was in late 1991. There was a take of $450,000 or so, and then somebody at the stat at I may be getting my banks wrong here, but Wells Fargo or First Interstate, who the bank was, slipped to the news media the amount of the take, and that's
Hmm.
a no-no because the FBI and the banking industry do not want to let people know how much money you can make robbing a bank. And
Yeah.
Casper, sitting right over the hill in the flatlands of South Central LA, heard that and said, "I am in the." He's in the right business, but in the wrong methodology, and that's when he started to send in, put together these bands of kids. I mean, they were kids, and
Hmm.
some of them, just because of where they came from the absolute ghettos of L.A. of South Central, they'd never even been in a bank until they walked into one with a semi-automatic rifle. And but yeah, it was that Tarzana robbery that triggered Casper to start doing that, and he ran hundreds of these before he got caught, and then others jumped in to do it as well. So that epidemic started with that one robbery with those they were called the West Hills Bandits, and
Hmm.
yep, and one employee letting out how much had been robbed.
Yeah, I love that you can trace it back to that story and that one point. And, Casper's just sitting watching the evening news and hears how much it is and, sits up
Yeah,
in his chair, I imagine, and says, let's do it.
yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a can do attitude down there in South
Yeah.
Central.
Oh man, that's funny. Yeah, so this is okay. So um let's try to like coerce this into like a story narrative because people have been hearing, Norco, which I want to dive into that because that's what your book is all about. So we're going to talk about that. But and that was kind of so LA's become like the bank robbery capital of the world because of the freeways and the easiness to get on and off,
Yeah.
the on ramps of a bank and get out of there really quick and everything. And then but the Norco 1980 event kind of isn't that kind of looked to as like the beginning of it?
Yeah, it's definitely at the early stages of I mean, LA had been the bank robbery capital of the world since, from the early 60s and, kind of post war. However, the number of bank robberies was, 500, 600 a year. It's a lot. Now they're only like 300. But then they had shot up to 1,000 a year by 1980. But yeah, I mean, the real epidemic exploded a little bit later on. But, the idea that, if you were someone who just wanted to get money on any level, and when you lived in Los Angeles, bank robberies were right. we're right at the top of the list of how you might do it. And so yeah, you know, again, the Norco bank robbery is May 9th, 1980. It's a takeover style robbery by 5 young men out of Orange County, California.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of working class guys. Two of the younger ones, the Delgado brothers from the barrio of Orange County, which, believe it or not, there was and still is to this day. But I mean, everybody thinks Orange County is just white
Yeah.
bread,
Newport
upper
Beach.
middle
Yeah.
class, yeah, and stuff. No, but there's some tough areas. And but what the motivations of these guys was I mean, they varied among them, but the leader of the guy who um, planned the robbery, recruited everyone else, was a guy named George Wayne Smith, and he was 28 years old at the time. And you're talking May 1980, which is more like the 70s than it is like the 80s. And George Smith and Chris Harvin, who's the other guy who planned it. George, they owned a house together, and they were really the guys who planned it, put it together. Particularly George Smith. Uh, they were born and raised. They were raised. I mean, they went adulthood in the 70s. So George Wayne Smith is from Orange County. He's from a working class neighborhood, and a couple things happen that are very unique to this era. Or at least very prevalent in this era that kind of propel him towards this. And number one is very early on, he gets involved in the very aggressively evangelical born again Christian movement, youth movement that sweeps through, well, originates in Orange County and eventually sweeps through the country, known as the Jesus movement. And these are ministries that are independent ministries, unaffiliated, and they have theologies that center around end times, book of Revelation, particularly the rapture coming, which then leads into this, the tribulations and the second coming. And the rapture is, if you are not good with God right at that moment, all his believers get raised up to meet their Lord in the sky, and everybody else gets left behind to ride out these horrors. If you ever read Book of Revelation, it's man, it's good old school demons swooping in from the sky, locusts, buckets of blood, oceans of blood. So, anyways, that looms heavily, but also Book of Revelation prophecy also centers on all these catastrophic events that are going to happen to mankind leading up to it. Social decay, lawless wars in the Middle East, breakdown of civil society, natural disasters, all these things that were going to lead up to the rapture. So you couldn't, for George Smith, he didn't think he could just be good with God. He had to be ready to ride out these catastrophes. And so he got involved in that early on. The other thing is, right out of high school, he joined the military. He was trained as an artilleryman in the army, stationed in Germany in the shadow of the Iron Curtain, and he was trained in tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. These are kind of like old school howitzers or rockets that launch these things on the battlefield, and that was that was the biggest threat, and probably the biggest threat of the Cold War, but certainly the biggest threat in the 70s was this proliferation. They were like the gateway nuke that would lead to nuclear war. And George Smith was certainly not alone in thinking that nuclear Armageddon would be not only possible, but almost inevitable. So when George looked out at the world in the 1970s, and he was looking for signs of the coming apocalypse, for Babylonian decay, social decay. There's a lot to see of it in the 70s. There was all that stuff. There were wars in the Middle East. There was the Iranian hostage crisis. There was, a lot of decadence in the 70s. A lot of the stuff that happened in the ideologies in the 60s became, ugly in the 70s. So, and if you're predisposed to be on the lookout for it, but George pegged the rapture and the catastrophes coming up with Cavalry Chapel, which he was a member, and Cavalry's founder picked it for before 1981. So, and the robbery was May of 1980. And but George also had a personality component that really kind of also propelled him. So he thought the end was coming, and he could see exactly how it was going to happen.
Right.
It was not an abstract concept for George, nuclear war. Um, the other is he had this grandiosity about him. He had this what we now would call uh, a narcissistic personality disorder,
Mm.
and this grandiosity about himself, this idea that he knew better than everyone else, this idea that his wants and his needs superseded everyone else, and he'd mostly channeled this for the good. I mean, this was a guy who'd do anything for you. All of his friends said, and he would.
Mm-hmm.
Lend you money, save your soul. He was a high achieving kid in high school. He was a captain of the tennis team. He was a championship tennis team. He was in the choir. He was the editor of the school newspaper on the chess team, and he
Wow.
funneled that towards good. Um, but also, he had a lot of downturns in his personal life leading up to this bank robbery. And when you're someone who thinks you're destined for greatness, and your personal life, he lost a marriage had failed. His family was no longer his children. His child was no longer living with him. He had lost his job. He was running out of money. There was this cognitive dissonance between who George thought he was and what he was at the time. So this might
Right.
have been a rough spot for you and me, but for him, it was an absolute disaster that he needed to get out of. So
Mm-hmm.
I know this is a long answer to what you said, but his motivations have been kind of they were difficult for me to they were important for me to try to nail down.
Mm-hmm.
So bottom line, George's reason for the money was he wanted to get a bunch of money, buy a cabin and a piece of land up in the mountains of Utah, stockpile it, and bring all of his loved ones there to ride out these catastrophic events, this breakdown of social order that would then lead into the rapture. And he kind of viewed himself as a foot soldier of God. Um, was that the question you asked?
Yeah. No, that's great because that's a critical part of, understanding this whole story is his motivation and his background and why he's doing this all. So that's great.
Yeah,
I love that.
the era in which it took place, the location in which it took place, they're all kind of fed into this. And of course the psychological makeup, but it's kind of a uniquely Southern California story, kind of a uniquely 1970s story in that respect. And I'm not suggesting born again Christianity leads people to rob banks, but if you have these ministries and these theologies that basically put your young members of your congregation with their backs against a wall. I mean, you're constantly saying, you got to be here every day. I mean, you got to be here with the church. You got to be ready because this is coming. This is coming, and it's the worst thing you can ever imagine. Well, some people are going to take. Some people are going to take a little bit different
We're
approach
gonna
rather
take action. Yeah.
than showing up at church. You know.
Yeah, no, totally. So it makes sense. So now, so he has this reasoning. He wants money so he can buy a cabin and be ready and hold up for all this. And so his best option for getting this money is a bank robbery.
Yeah, well, it's they were growing a lot of weed in their backyard. So his the guy he owns a house with a guy named Christopher Harvin, and they're both landscapers at this parks department, the municipal parks department in Cypress, California. And
Wow.
Chris is a year older. And Chris is more kind of like a troublemaker, but he also is a bit of a survivalist. And he has this. He's taken in with all these beliefs in these doomsday scenarios that were bandied about in the 70s, population bombs, asteroid strikes, but a lot of natural disasters, particularly in California, massive earthquakes that would devastate the area. Again, not that far fetched, but
Yeah.
we'll wait and see, right? But and he particularly believed in a book that had been put out called the Jupiter Effect, and there was an alignment of planets that in 1982 it did happen, of course, and it was rare, in which they were all lined up on the same side of the sun within a 70-degree angle area, and the writers of the book said it was going to cause gravitational pulls that would set off tides tidal changes that would set volcanoes off along the Pacific Rim and earthquakes and things like that. And that was set for 1982. So Chris Harvin, he kind of threw George's theology on top of that a little bit, but they owned a house out in Miraloma. So he kind of saw this coming, but he's also a guy who'd do anything on a dare. He's a bit of a troublemaker. And he got drafted into the Army, and he purposely got himself thrown out after 2 years. So he's kind of a roustabout and kind of started to back out of this thing. But George is a very intelligent, very persuasive, and very relentless guy. So he kept Chris in. Chris brought in his younger brother, 27-year-old Russell Harvin, who was basically just smoking weed in his parents' house and doing nothing with his life. And he's just a guy who kind of went along with anything. And especially Chris. Chris is a very dominant personality. So Chris said, this is what we're going to do. And then George recruited the Delgado brothers, who I mentioned before, 21-year-old Manny Delgado, who's also worked at the landscape as a landscaper with them. And Manny got his 17-year-old little brother, Billy Delgado, involved. And, they all had their reasons. Russ was diabetic. Somehow he got in his mind that he'd die before age 35. He kind of felt like he had nothing to lose. And he kind of went along. He was like, yeah, okay, $50,000 or whatever, that'd be great. And then Manny had a kid and another one on the way, and was looking for a score. His little brother Billy, he had rheumatoid arthritis, and he'd been told or believed somewhere along the way he wouldn't walk past age 25. So they kind of had different reasons, but George kind of this guy who got on it. And the one thing they had in common is George, these guys are not stupid, but they're not sophisticated. These other guys, for them, George is the smartest guy they know by far. I mean, George is, and he is. I mean, guy can, talk about anything and, and sound smart as hell on it. And he was in a lot of cases, but particularly theology. But, so when George comes up and says, I got a plan that can't fail, these guys are like, well, George says it's all right. It probably can't fail, and
Right.
take over robbery. If you time it right, you can walk away with a couple $100,000.
Yeah, sounds pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like maybe we ought to be getting.
It's very persuasive here, what you're saying.
Yeah, don't get any ideas, folks.
Right. Okay, man. Oh, man. So, can you just kind of bring us into it and walk us through the events of the day and everything?
Yeah, so here's the plan. Well, one little unusual thing is George and Chris Harvin had started to turn their house, this kind of ramshackle kind of, well, it's just kind of your typical ranch-style stucco affair, Southern California, but on a quarter acre. But they started to turn it into this fortress, mostly kind of due to their beliefs about the end of the world. And they strung it with barbed wire. They put carpet tacks nailed through so anybody tried to climb over, and they dug this pit that went down 10 feet from their backyard, went underneath their house so they could use it as an escape tunnel or a bunker. So they were starting to get a little bit nutty, and then they started buying weapons. But here's the bank robbery plan. You have your 5 young men there, and by the way, none of them have any significant criminal records, certainly no history of violence. And the first thing is that Chris says, I'm not doing any bank robbery unless I'm not going to any bank with a handgun. So we need to be armed to the teeth. George is right on that. So the first thing they do is they start stockpiling some weapons, and they go out and they buy military versions of civilian versions of military grade weapons. These are AR-15s. They're semi-automatic, high-powered rifles. Called frequently referred to as assault rifles, although that's a politically charged term these days, and high capacity magazines and thousands of rounds of ammunition. So, they've got 40 round magazines that they're taping together jungle style, one up, one down, one up. So you pop it out, you flip it over, you put it right back in, and a semi-automatic weapon fires as fast as you can pull the trigger. So these guys could fire 120 shots under 2 minutes, no problem. They also are all carrying, so they each have one of those, mostly 223s, which is the the round size that a caliber bullet of a M16. And then George Smith has a 308, which is an absolute cannon. It's three times the size. they're not an animal in the world. You can't drop in a single round from a half mile away with a 308. I mean, it's a
Jeez.
beast. Yeah, I mean it's a beast. And these are bullets that fragment, they tumble, they're just the nastiest things around.
Yeah.
And so they load up on all that, and then they also take the anarchist cookbook and they make homemade fragmentation grenades made out of beer cans with a detonation device and a bunch of shrapnel surrounding it, and then they tape it up with masking tape and they put a bunch of them on dowels so they could launch them out of the barrel of a shotgun. So you could light it, launch it, or you could light it, throw it. A couple dozen of those, Molotov cocktails, gas masks, compasses, radios. They loaded this vehicle for this thing with just duffel bags full of stuff, cold
Man.
cars parked away with hunting rifles, and I mean, it's just crazy. George Smith's grandiosity. So George Smith's grandiosity has a lot to do with this plan. He tried to account for every contingency that might come up, and in the process, you almost build in something that's going to go wrong. If you have so many moving parts. But anyways, the basic plan was, after they had armed themselves like that, they also had ski masks, military ponchos, just loaded for action there. And what they did is, that morning they sent the Delgado brothers and Russ Harvin over to a shopping mall, the Brea Mall, about 20 miles away in Orange County, and they stole a van at gunpoint from a guy named Gary Hackala, taped him up, shoved him in the back in this little cabinet that he had in the back of his van. And this is a panel van, this is so he could not report it stolen. And then they took that back over to Norco. They met up with George and Chris, loaded up all these bombs and everything else into this van. And then they went about a mile away to a strip mall, and in an alleyway in the back, they put a diversion bomb. This was 6 beer bottles filled with leaded gasoline and a detonation device, and they put it under a gas main behind a strip mall. And that goes off, sets the gas main off. Every first responder, every cop is going to go to a mile away from this bank. They're sitting across from the bank waiting for this to happen, and as soon as that happens, they're going to hit the bank. Well, a passerby saw it, jumped out of his truck, put it out with a fire extinguisher. I mean, it blew, but the gas main didn't blow. And George and all his guys are sitting there with poor Gary Hackala taped up in the back. They're sitting right across from the Security Pacific Bank at 4th and Hamner at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon. Busy Southern California intersection, Riverside County. And they decided they should have, just called it a kidnapping and gone home. But George decides he's going in anyways. And so that's how this starts. And they pull up. Billy Delgado's behind the wheel. The other 4 in their ski masks and everything enter into the bank for a takeover robbery. And this is two points of really bad luck. One is, I don't know if it's bad luck, but it was a bank teller at a bank across the street that saw them go into that bank. And that's the person who called the Riverside County Sheriff. So the call went into the Riverside County Sheriff's as they went into the bank.
Man.
And, yeah, I know. So, there actually was. There was a teller who managed to squeeze the silent alarm, but the Security Pacific branch they'd wired their alarm incorrectly, and it went to the Corona Police Department, one town over. Corona scrambled all their cops to the Corona branch of the Security Pacific Bank. 5 miles.
Oh
away.
Man.
Yeah.
Oh,
So there's funny, again,
right.
It's a tragic event in the end, but it's there's things like that. But it was the teller across the street who looked over and said, "Geez, Louise, what the hell is going on over there?"
Yeah, man, what are the odds?
Yeah.
Crazy.
So that's the setup. That's what leads into to them running into that bank at 3:30 in the afternoon, and banks closed at 4:00 back in the bad old days.
Oh yeah, good point. I didn't even think about that. Now they're open until 6 and 7.
Yeah. Well, and also people are the reason what that's relevant about is people are, back then credit cards were not as prevalent and ATMs were almost non-existent, and people walked in on Fridays with their paychecks, deposited some, and took a huge amount out in cash. So banks loaded up with cash on Fridays. George
Mm.
picked the right day, picked the wrong bank, but but by 3:30, most of that cash had gone out of that bank because everything was taking longer. None of these guys had robbed a bank. They didn't know, So when you hit it at 3:30, that branch had actually ordered more cash to be delivered. They were afraid they were going to run out of cash, but it had not been delivered. And so when they burst in that account, that bank, they got all the cash, but there was only $20,000 left in that thing. The vault was empty. The only thing was the teller line and the teller reserve boxes that had any cash in them at all. So it was a
Man.
lousy take in the end. But
Yeah. When you consider their gross income after their expenses, it's, their net isn't very much, with all that preparation.
no, not a good return on ROI, as they say in
Yeah.
the business.
In the bank robbery business.
Yeah.
Man, oh man, okay. And then so what goes on inside? What's the story there?
Well, on the surface of it's kind of pulled off like a classic takeover. They get everybody. It's busy in there. They get everybody on the floor. George acts as a rover. They send Chris walks into the bank with over 700 rounds of ammunition strapped to his chest and bandoliers. He marches the manager over to the vault. Not being a sophisticated bank robber, he doesn't notice that they were worried. They were like, when this manager's walking over, she's thinking, the two of them are thinking, this guy's going to blow his top when he looks in that vault and it's empty. But they
Yeah.
distracted him, got him to the reserve, and they cleaned out that. Manny Delgado vaulted the teller line, jumped up on the teller line. It he was carrying a riot gun, it's a Winchester shotgun with a pistol grip, and he got all the tellers to empty their stuff. Manny even took the coins, which led one teller to think, God, these guys not know what they're doing. You don't
Mm-hmm.
you don't
You
take
don't take the heavy coins, yeah.
And then Russell Harvin is sent to go guard the other egg, the west entrance of the Security Pacific Bank. And Russell's just, he just doesn't know what he's doing. He can't pay attention to his only job. People are walking into the bank, and then he's sticking the gun in their face and saying, "Get down on the floor." One woman opens the door to the bank. Russell sticks the gun in her face because he's too busy watching the bank robbery and hiding behind a plastic ficus plant. That woman just looks at him and just lets the door goes and walks back out to the parking lot. So a little bit of comedy, but also just a very tense situation. All kinds of drama unfold in that bank, but they do get out in about 2.5 minutes. But that teller across the street had called the Riverside County Sheriff when they went in. And, there's no 911 back then either. So they, at least not there. So it took a while for them to get the tone out, the 211 tone, the 211 dispatch out, robbery in progress. And about the time they do that, that tone goes out right as they're coming out of the bank. The four guys are saying, George yells time, everybody get out. They all pile out. And they step outside the bank. And here's another really piece of bad luck. And it's kind of bad luck for everyone involved. In the end. And that's that when that tone drops, that 211 tone, robbery in progress, dispatch goes out. There's a deputy named Glenn Pulaski who is at that intersection in his vehicle looking straight at that bank. So he's on Hamner Avenue, about ready to make a left turn. Some people say he was going to the bank. He denies this, going to the bank to cash his paycheck, his Friday paycheck. But so he is right there. And if you hear the radio traffic, it's under 2 seconds. You hear this 211 in progress, Security Pacific Bank, 4th and Hamner. And he says, I'm 1097. I'm on scene. So he's, it doesn't leave Glenn Pulaski any time to kind of think this through. Normally when you're, I'm an EMT, so I know when you're on your way to a scene, you're listening to radio traffic, you're kind of thinking of what you might be going into, what you're going to do. Glenn Pulaski's already there, and within 5 seconds, they're shooting at him. They're blowing his light bar out off the top of his car, and he doesn't even know that that's happening. He's like, "What the hell's going on with my light bar?" It's all happened so fast.
Jeez.
He turns on his lights. He makes the left turn. George sees him. Chris sees him, and they start firing on him. And he comes around. He comes right into the bank parking lot, which is probably, if he had more time, he wouldn't have done that. He would have waited for backup. There's 211 in progress. There's 211 silent. 211 silents are almost always false alarms. They're silent alarms that were triggered in liquor stores, banks. They're almost always false alarms. 211 progress is confirmed. That's bank robbery in progress. And Pulaski was a good cop, but he probably would not have pulled right into that bank, but he came head to head with those guys. He came nose to nose with that green van sitting there, and four guys lined up, three of them firing high-powered rifles, and Manny Delgado unloading a riot gun 2 car lengths away. And you hear the radio traffic. He said, "I'm taking fire now." 4 seconds later, I've been hit, and it turns into an 1199 officer down. And when that goes out over a frequency, every cop anywhere in that area starts to converge on that location.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. And it wasn't just Riverside County sheriffs. It was California Highway Patrol self-dispatching off the freeways, Riverside City cops, Ontario. I mean, everybody. I mean, and again, there's radio traffic. I have all the original radio traffic unedited, and man, you hear that light up like you cannot believe once somebody says 1199 officer down. So
yeah,
that's stage 2, and that's what develops into this ferocious firefight that unfolds in a crowded Southern California intersection on a Friday afternoon, involving Pulaski and the 2 other deputies who were patrolling Norco at the time. Glenn there's over 500 rounds fired. In fact, the detective who investigated that area swears it was probably closer to 1,000, but some 600, 500 fired in about 4 minutes. You can imagine who's doing most of the shooting, because the deputies in those days were guarding the Wild West with the same thing they had for 100 years, a 6-shooter and a Winchester shotgun. And they're up against these guys with just unloading. But Pulaski's vehicles hit 46 times. He was wounded in 5 times. He was hitting an artery on the elbow. He's calling out over the thing. I need an ambulance. I'm bleeding badly. And so this just turns into a pitched firefight in the middle of this in this intersection. But Pulaski manages to unload his shotgun, and one pellet strikes Billy Delgado, the van driver, as he's driving away in the back of the neck and paralyzes him. Eventually kills him 15 minutes later. But he becomes paralyzed immediately from the neck down, and the van rolls off the side of the road into a chain link fence. And now Manny Delgado, his older brother, sitting there watching this, and they can't get Billy out of the seat, so they abandon this van. And now there's they start piling out. They're still firing on Pulaski, who's pulled out of the bank. He did this miraculous thing when he started to take fire. He ducked down in his seat, he threw the car in reverse, and he shot it back onto 4th Street. And it's ended up sliding sideways in the middle of the road. So he's sideways in the middle of the road, dives out of his car. He's already wounded, stands up as the van takes off to try to escape with 17-year-old Billy Delgado, and he fires 4 rounds 4 cartridges from a shotgun through the back window of the van as they're pulling away, while the guys in the back are shooting out the back window at him. So, and then he clips Billy Delgado with one pellet from this, and so they get out of there. They start offloading all their duffel bags. They got all their high-powered rifles still in their ski masks, and they start to fan out in this Southern California intersection. People are running for their lives. I mean, bailing out of their cars. These guys are fanning out and walking up these, the cars are back to 50 cars, in each direction on a 4-lane major boulevard going through this town. And, these guys are just waving guns and sticking them in people's places, trying to find another getaway vehicle. And they do. They find the perfect getaway vehicle. It's a Ford F-250 pickup truck being driven by this heavy equipment mechanic named Mike Linville, and stick a handgun at him. He jumps out, and this thing is it's a beast. It's a Ford F-250. It's been modified for this purpose. It's got tool cabinets on the sides. They're filled with tools, fabricated metal. It's also got these acetylene and oxygen tanks. These those heavy ones, those tall ones that are mounted right behind the the cab, and nothing the law enforcement's firing is going to penetrate that. So that's like perfect fire. They've got raised up sides that are fortified, and that's what they pile into. George and Russ Harvin in the back. George was his 308. He's been wounded. He got hit by a deputy named Andy Delgado, who was firing shotgun rounds into him. He got hit in the groin and was bleeding badly. Russ took a shotgun pellet under his scalp, but didn't penetrate his skull. Those two guys hopped in the back. They got all their bombs and everything else still with them. Chris Harvin jumps behind the wheel. He's got a long Colt 44 in his lap, and then Manny Delgado's got a Heckler 223. It's the Rolex of semi-automatic assault rifles, and he gets in the passenger seat, but he pulls himself completely out of the cab. He's sitting on the windowsill with his torso entirely out of the cab, firing that weapon over the top of the cab. So these guys have an absolute tank of a vehicle, and they've got two 223s and a 308 mounted on three different things. I mean, and that's what they leave that intersection with. I mean, it's almost a military grade vehicle at that point, particularly what they're up against. And that firefight only lasts four minutes. But Pulaski's injured. 3 of the bank robbers, one's dead. Two of them civilians crash their cars into each other. 2 of them get hit by gunfire. 1 or 2 get grazed by gunfire. A 15-year-old girl who's out there taking a driving lesson from her father gets their car clipped by Pulaski when he's coming out. Father looks up and takes a 223 fragment, just grazes the side of his head once his car crashes, because they crashed into another car. His 15-year-old daughter takes a fragment in the back. This is a bad scene at that intersection, I'll tell you that. And then they take off in that truck, and it turns into a running gun battle through the suburban streets of Riverside County at that point, where they're just weaving through these semi-rural, often suburban streets, and you've got every cop in the area descending on them, trying to follow the radio traffic. Where are they going now? And they're just changing roads. They're trying to get back to their house, that compound that they made. They think they're going to get there, and they are shooting people. They're ramming cars out of intersections, and so the complexion has really changed all along the way. Because after that, it goes on to a crowded Southern California freeway. After that, where they're throwing fragmentation grenades out, and they shoot down a police helicopter over there, and then it ends up 7,000 feet up on a fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains, in an ambush. So it really did kind of change its personality and complexion along the way, and but there was constant fire. I mean, the toll from this thing is when it's all over. It's 4-mile pursuit and everything, and ambush, and goes on for over an hour, and then of course there's a manhunt the following morning to get try to catch the escaped bank robbers. So when this is all over, there's 3 dead. There's almost 20 wounded, including 7 law enforcement officers, 1 law enforcement officer dead, civilians injured, wounded, 32 police vehicles either disabled or destroyed by gunfire, explosives, police helicopter shot down. So the scope of the thing is just absolutely staggering.
Yeah. Man, oh man, this is an insane story.
It is an insane story. I was like 18 years old, and I lived in Whittier, about 20 miles away from Norco. I was a bit of a news junkie and a kind of a surf punk kid, and but I used to read the LA Times every day, and I just remember opening the next morning, Saturday morning. I was just absolutely astonished. And then the story went into the next day, because the next day there was the largest manhunt in California history up in the mountains of extremely rugged mountains and canyons above Los Angeles Basin, San Gabriel Forest, Mount Baldy, and so it went on for 2 days. But I was absolutely astonished by it, and it's always stuck with me. It's just kind of how it looped back around to this book 35 years later. Took a while to get around to it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what was Why did you write this book? What was the impetus that caused you to do this?
On the 35th anniversary, I actually pitched an article to the LA Times because I do some journalism, some book reviews for the Hearst newspapers, for some others. Not a full time reporter, journalist and stuff, but some freelance stuff. And I pitched it to him on the 35th anniversary of the Norco bank robbery, and I thought, my angle was I was going to look at how something like this, really, again, a tragedy. I mean, people died. I mean, and people, people suffered tremendously afterwards, not just for losing people, but post-traumatic stress disorder. It's really a horrific event in the end. But I want to look at how an event like that ripples out over the years. Like, how does it impact? How do you look at it 35 years later? How does it ripple out? How does it pass down through generations? What's the long-term effects? Do guys get over this? People involved, do they get over it? Are they still haunted by it? And even though that did not pan out, that article, I did start to do a little more research than just what I remembered from age 17. And it was clear there was a much bigger story here that involved all the things I just mentioned. Afterwards, the deputies turned on their own department. They turned on each other. Some of them accused each other of leaving them to die. They were so outgunned. They were so not trained for this. Not necessarily any less than anyone else in this country at the time, because these weapons were not nearly as prevalent. They're starting to see them show up on the streets from drug gangs, things like that. But we're used to these huge events, mostly these mass shootings and stuff, where these weapons are around all where they weren't back then. They were illegal. Everything was legal. These were legally purchased weapons, but
Right.
this prevalent. And but the deputies blamed their own department for not preparing them properly, for not reacting afterwards, and these guys turned on each other, and it was just a really there's a lot of human drama in this, and that is always the heart and soul of any story. I mean, if this is just a bang bang shoot 'em up thing, as astonishing as it was, probably it would not have caught my interest nearly as much. As you can see, I spent a lot of time backgrounding, if that's a word, doing the backstories and the impact on a human level of not just deputies who lost a fellow deputy, who almost lost their lives, but also these bank robbers who threw away 5 young men who threw away their lives in a single day. Their children, parents, the Harvin brothers, Delgado brothers, they're parents who would never even imagine their child might get this. They wake up one morning and they got 2 kids, and they wake up, and they turn on the evening news and find out they have none. It's
crazy.
So, but yeah, it was kind of pitching that article, and then starting to read up a little bit more and starting to talk to a couple of the people involved. And I thought, wow, this is a story that should be told and is also worth telling as a writer, for sure.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your, kind of researching the book and preparing about it, because you got to interview Russell Harvin, right?
And Chris Harvin.
Okay.
Yeah. I Anna wrote letters back and forth with George Smith. So I visited. It took a lot of relentless letter writing and things like that, because their first reaction was, "Yeah, sure, you're going to tell a fair story." This guy's been in prison for 35 years. They're like, fairness isn't really high on their expectation list. But anyways, Russell Harvin was the first, and he's actually been cellmates with his brother Chris for most of the last 20 years. They're pretty well behaved inmates, so they were up at Lancaster at the time, right up in the high desert there, Lancaster Penitentiary. I went up to the visiting room and I interviewed Russ there. Being my first prison interview, I made a little bit of a hash of it. Not the interview itself. Russ and I grew up 10 miles away from each other, almost in the same type of neighborhoods. We used to go. I mean, he's a 8 years older than me, but we went to the same concerts. We went to the same, so Russ and I were able to, once we got through past the unpleasantness of Norco, we had a pretty good rapport,
Uh-huh.
but being what people around me would say Peter's typical self, I didn't really read the instructions on what you're supposed to do when you go into the prison. Particularly what you're supposed to wear. And so,
Okay.
I'm like, I'll just show up, it's the prison. But
I'm not inside. I'm visiting. Yeah.
yeah, what you're specifically not supposed to wear is anything close to what the prisoners are wearing, which are denim blue pants and blue shirts. So I'm thinking, I thought about this. I don't want to be a dork, I don't want to be the dorky white guy inside the prison in my chinos and stuff. So I said, I'll put on some Levi's and and I had this blue shirt. So you can see where this is going. So I pull up to the front gate, and the guy who's got the gate duty, the guard who's got the gate duty, just into the parking lot onto the grounds at Lancaster. It's a real sprawling facility. I mean, it's really big prison.
Mm-hmm.
He's an old timer. Clearly, this is probably a job he earned for going over. He just looks at me and he goes, "You can't come in here wearing that." I was like, what? And he's like, "You're dressed like the prison." He goes, "That's what the prisoners wear." So I said, "Oh, Dad." So I said, "Well, what do I do?" And he goes, "Look, there's a Walmart." And he's been through this before with idiots like me.
Mm-hmm.
But he goes, "There's a Walmart 2 miles down the road. Go there. You got to buy all new clothes." So I go to the Walmart and I'm shopping for clothes in the Walmart. And so I'm like, well, my shoes are black. Should I get a black pair? And I'm thinking, like, why am I matching up my clothes for a prison visit? Like, who am I trying to impress here? So in the end, I end up getting chinos and a red like golf polo shirt, the brown chinos. So I end up looking like the complete suburban dork that I was trying not to be. And I go back there, and so it goes in, and I actually changed in the Walmart bathroom, which
Mm-hmm.
mystifies them when they want to see my receipt when I'm leaving. "Can I see the receipt?" And they're like, "Where's your stuff?" And I said, "I'm wearing it." They're like, "What?" I'm like, "It just changed in your store." So then I go back to the prison. Lets me in the front gate. I do, they say you can bring $20 in to use from the vending machines. I don't notice it says you can only bring in ones, so I have to walk the 20, the quarter mile, the half mile back to my car and get rid of my $20 bill. So eventually I get there, and you're standing up in front of this group of people who are waiting to get into the prison, to the visiting area. And
Uh-huh.
while you're talking to the guys at the guards, they turn you around, frisk you, put you through a metal detector, everything else. And I get
Mm-hmm.
inside, and I thought a good icebreaker with Russ Harvin when he walks out. I say to him, I said, "It's really nice to meet you." And he goes, "Yeah, well, we'll see." But Chris is, Russ is, he looks like Santa Claus now. He's this big, he's got this pot belly on him, and he's still got the same beard, but it's all white hair, kind of a twinkle in his eyes. So I thought as an icebreaker, I'll tell him a story, about like me getting stopped at the front gate. And when I get to the part, I said, "So I went to Walmart and I bought all new clothes to get in here." He goes, "Yeah, I can tell." He reaches over and he grabs the tag off the back of my pants and pulls it off. So I'd gone and taken all the tags you get on stuff. The one that I hadn't seen was that insert on the back of your pocket. And so
Yeah.
I've been, so I go into this prison. I'm in the visitor center. I'm in all these things. I go through the guards. The only guy who has the common decency to tell me I still got the tag on my pants is the cop killer.
Oh
So
man.
that's probably too long a story, but yeah, I interviewed him. I interviewed Chris Harvin up in Vacaville. Chris took about 3 years to get through. In fact, I didn't get through him to him. He told Russ, "Do not do this interview. No good can come of it." Problem is their crime gets brought back up into the public consciousness. He says they'll start to get treated like crap by prison guards. They just will.
Oh.
And
Huh.
uh, uh, so that's why Chris didn't want to do it. They're obviously very suspicious guys at this point, but Chris eventually did. I went up to Vacaville State Penitentiary up near Sacramento, interviewed him. Remarkably candid, these guys. They really are. George,
Mm-hmm.
more guarded. I will say all three of them are mostly preoccupied with what they felt was a extremely unfair trial. Particularly their belief that a San Bernardino County sheriff deputy was the one who killed the Riverside deputy in the ambush up in Lytle Creek on that fire road. They firmly believe that it was friendly fire, and so they're borderline indignant that they're still in prison, even though they were convicted of 46 major felonies, including 24 counts of attempted murder on a police
Yeah.
officer, kidnapping, grand theft auto,
They brush
explosives.
over that. Yeah.
All right. Russ Harmon's like, we should have gotten 25 to life. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Be out.
Right.
But I guess if that's your situation, you're grasping for anything, right?
Yeah. It's hard to put ourselves in that position.
Yeah. Interesting to talk to those guys, though.
Yeah, man, that is an experience I can imagine to go and into a prison for an interview like that. I never would have even thought about wearing the clothes the same or anything, but it makes sense.
You got to read. Yeah, the
You
trick
gotta
is
read the pamphlet. Yeah.
read stuff they give you and tell you to read. Yeah, you're not in danger. I mean, I never felt like I was in danger. It's a visiting room. Kind of indoor, outdoor. I mean, there's some very worrisome people in there, but it's not really that. But it is, it's a place you hopefully won't ever otherwise find yourself in. And and those kind of experiences are, I mean, the sensory overload of what, a lot of it's exactly what you thought it would be. A lot of it's not at all what you thought it'd be. So experience and talking to people like that is a shift. People who have thrown their lives away, who are just, Russ Harvin says, I was a happy-go-lucky kid, and now I'm just a bitter old man waiting for my toe tag. And that happened just because Russ didn't think it through.
Yeah.
He said, it never occurred to me that this would end in a gun battle. He said, even though he was, they had armed him like that, he just thought George knew what he was doing, and there was just no way it was going to end like this. So,
yeah,
man,
crazy. So was it? I mean, the fact that that cop was sitting there right at that light, right by the bank, was that kind of like almost the one thing that sort of made this all turn so bad, you think?
Well, had these guys robbed that bank, drove a half mile to their getaway cars, their cold cars, dumped that van and Gary Hackler, the hostage, in that parking lot of the Little League field, hopped in their cars, gone off to Vegas and laundered their money through the casinos there, what would have been the harm, right? These guys, I don't know, maybe they would have gone on and, other than $20,000. But as luck would have it, Glenn Pulaski happens to be right there. And if Glenn Pulaski is not right there, even if he is a half mile away, this probably never happens. And in the end, Billy Delgado's not dead. The other two guys aren't dead. So, yeah, the other thing is, talking about the bank robbery capital of the world and freeways being the key. What's the golden rule of LA bank robberies? Rob a bank near a freeway on-ramp. George Smith robbed his own bank. He went for familiarity over strategy, and his bank was 8 miles away from the closest freeway on-ramp. 7 miles one direction, 9 miles the other. And so they robbed a bank nowhere near a freeway. So that certainly played into it, but mostly exactly what you said. The dumb luck of Glenn Pulaski being right at that intersection when that tone dropped. Because Norco's not small, not the biggest city in LA. kind of a semi-rural, but it's in terms of miles, there's only 3 deputies in that entire town.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them happened to be right there.
Yeah, I just find those to think about those instances of chance that are just did happen, or what, the endless amount of things that could have possibly happened, you know, just by these one simple moments of chance like that. I just find it interesting to think about.
Yeah, well, you're very good about pointing that out in what you do. It's part of the curiosityness, right? I mean, how things can turn on such a small, in just an instant, or on just a coincidence, or are they more? I mean, but yeah, it is astonishing, and having interviewed so many of these deputies, the widow of the officer, that the deputy who died, family members of the bank robbers who died. You could see how much would have been spared. How
Yep.
much would have been spared, because it couldn't. Even if they did decide to rob banks later on, it couldn't have gotten worse than this. Really,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yep. Man. Okay, well, let's jump ahead or jump to something else real quick. I just want to talk about you mentioned it earlier, and if you could just kind of share like a little maybe overview story of it about the hole, the tunneling hole under to get to the bank, because I just find that such a delightful
Yeah,
story.
yeah, it is. Now this one's actually pretty funny and charming to the end. So this is oh man, this would be 1988, I think. So let's just call it the late 80s. There is uh, again, Imperial Bank. If I got to get my bank straight, because there's a couple key bank robberies. Uh, yeah, I think that one out in Tarzana was the first interstate. This is Imperial Bank Building. It's on Sunset Boulevard, a little bit into the towards Hollywood, um, near Laurel Canyon, and these guys were this crew were gonna did a tunnel job on it, which is, just what you think. These guys are burrow underneath the bank, wait for the right time, pop through the bottom of the vault, and then spend a Saturday night inside the vault, just
Yeah.
emptying and rifling it. But these guys, they made their way underneath this bank, through the storm drain system under LA, and they had actually were entering in, and they pulled this job over the course of weeks. They were working on this job, and they were loading up ATVs at a different location, a long way away from that bank, and driving these giant power tools and cement drills and everything else on a daily basis on ATVs, UTVs, through these storm drains. They were getting to this. They had a little side drain that they went up that took them to underneath this bank. They tapped into the electrical system of the bank itself. So they were tapping into their power system to run these things. They would sit there and they would wait until nightfall and wait till the bank closed. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they didn't realize that there was some bank employees working late. Like a bank manager could hear this. They started to, they kept. There were employees and managers who was like, I'm hearing something over the weekend. They'd be like, "What is that rumbling noise?" These guys set off the Muzak system. The the piped-in music system. At one point, they were because they were tapping into the they were trying to splice into the all the wires going into this bank, and they
Yeah.
set off the music system. So they called those people, and the bank was like, "What the hell is going on?" Somebody's working on a weekend, and then the Perry Como flute rendition starts coming on, and then they have blinking lights, and then they'd hear this purring and this rumbling, and they couldn't figure it out. And these guys broke through on a Saturday, and they spent hours in that vault, emptying it out. And they one thing that was kind of, in addition to getting the money out of it, they took crowbars to the safety deposit boxes in there, and they got an incredible amount of. They got a first edition leaves of grass, Walt Whitman. They got a couple, I think, I don't know what they were, Renoirs or Picasso sketches. They got
Man.
rare coins. They got a number of things out of there, but they took a long time in there. And it's just uh, when the FBI showed up and they look at this, they were just like, "Holy moly, you got to be kidding me!" And then it all made sense. The stuff from what the employees had been, and they went down there. Of course, they crawled down there into the storm drain and couldn't believe what they found. I mean, these guys had built like scaffolding to get up to the level that they could, and they needed to work these giant drills. They were puttying up the thing. I mean, they were spackling over their entrance every day at the end of the day, piling on tools, driving them all the way out. So, and then all the dirt they tunneled through, they had to tunnel through. Actually, it was a ton of dirt. I mean, it was about, I think it was like 30 yards of dirt they tunneled to get underneath that vault. Well, it's a storm drain. They just dump it out there and the water would sweep it away. Even though you don't get a ton of water in a storm drain in LA, it was enough to, or they just cart out all their dirt. So it was pretty sophisticated. They were actually working on a couple other banks, and the FBI, I forget exactly how, but they figured it out. They figured out where these guys might be, and they went down into storm drains, and sure enough, they found one of them in progress. And then those guys just disappeared. They've never been found. Nobody has any idea who they were.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's the last tunnel job that was ever done in a bank in LA.
That's it, huh?
Yeah. Well,
man,
it's a lot of work
for now. Yeah, that is a lot of work. Man, oh man, that's just so crazy. Actually, it just feels like a cartoon. It feels like a buddy comedy.
Well, yeah, no, it's definitely like a caper, but it's there are this epidemic of bank robberies has swept through Los Angeles during the bank robbery capital of the world days, roughly, 1980, 1997. There are so many stories, so many, either whether they're just crazy stuff like this or whether they're this whole, baby bandit thing that blew up in the 90s, or whether it's some of these guys who are just guys with no criminal records and cocaine habits hanging out in the Melrose district, or brushing elbows with celebrities who go on to suddenly start robbing banks and rob 65 of them before they're caught. Yeah, it is a world of stories, and it's funny. You can mention this to people who've lived through that era, and they won't even know. They're like, "Did I know that? I guess I might have known that." You kind of live through a period, and you think, you don't, you might not even know it was happening.
Yeah.
that your own town had that title. So
Yeah. Interesting. And then, so I guess just to kind of, wrap this up into a nice story, perhaps, what was kind of the cause for LA to lose the title of bank robbery capital of the world?
because San Francisco Bay Area became LA.
San
They don't want to
Francisco took
admit
it over.
there's two things there. There's the what caused the dramatic decrease in bank robberies,
Yeah.
and there are a couple things that are very controversial. But San Francisco Bay Area did become the bank robber. They're the ones who grabbed the throne away, and it's just because they got so big and so many freeways there, and they became a sprawl. They won't admit that they are, but sorry.
This guy's got some beef with San Francisco.
Take a jab at them every chance we can. But really, there were a couple factors that led to this decline in bank robberies beginning about 1995. 94, 95. Well, peaked in 92, but then started to dramatically taper off. One is technology. Resolution on cameras got better. They started later later they began to, they had cameras that would automatically send out these photos, and they'd be texted to every cop in the region of the photo of these guys, and usually a photo of their getaway vehicle with the plates on them. People
Mhm.
with cell phones. The resolution on these cameras. You put it on the news, and then it's like, oh, I don't. I mean, you've seen the real grainy, crappy ones where you're like, I don't know if that was my own brother, I'm not sure I'd know who it is. And
Yep.
but these are clear, tracking people. It just got to where it was not such a sure thing. Also, as I mentioned, when the banks started losing a ton of money from these, from workers' comp and everything else, they got tough about it again. They started to put up the plexiglass again in the real high risk areas. Gates, vaults were made better. The ATM machines, which automatically deactivate for 15 minutes, so you can point a gun at an employee, but they can't open that ATM. It just became less profitable. Your chances of getting caught went way up with all the technology, which was easily and cheaply put in. Like
Mhm.
I said, that's just the basic barriers that banks were reluctant to do before. And then there was also the couple things. There was the federal sentencing guidelines, which was a very controversial thing that came in the 90s. And this was when the feds came in and said, if you're convicted of a federal crime, which bank robbery is, it's always a federal crime. Um, that crime itself, it said mandatory you had to serve 80% of your sentence before you could be eligible for parole, and then we're tacking on 5 extra years for use of a weapon, and they raised it up to these guys were it was like a uh, um, uh, revolving door. The
Mhm.
federal prison system for bank robbers. They would go in, they'd be out in 3 to 5 years. The FBI guys are seeing the same guys over and over and over. And not only that, there's like a finishing school for bank robbers because all the bank robbers are in federal penitentiary.
Yeah.
Unless they've created a murder and then they might throw them in the local something a crime that supersedes the bank robbery itself. They go in there though and they come out better bank robbers because they swap stories and techniques and
Yeah.
everything else. And
Show and tell, yeah.
yeah, so they were seeing the same guys over and over and over, particularly the real hardcore guys, and all of a sudden now these guys are getting 20-year sentences and having to serve 18 of them or whatever. I think it's like 95% of the sentence I think you had to serve.
Mhm.
That of course has its very negative effects as well, especially when it comes to mandatory drug use sentencing and things like that. But when it came to bank robberies, it got a lot of these guys off the streets, the hardcore guys off the streets. They stopped seeing them anymore. Then California had its 3 strikes rule law that came in. So a lot of these guys are getting locked away for 3 felonies and your life in prison without parole.
Mhm.
So that was pulling a lot of them off. And then the technology, and then the crack cocaine epidemic started to taper off for any number of reasons, but uh, some of it, this mandatory sentencing, but that's a whole different story. But drug addiction dropped dramatically. Um,
Mhm.
you know, I think people forget or weren't alive at the time, but the 70s and the 80s were vicious times for crime rates, drug abuse. It almost to a degree that would be unimaginable today. But they did start to taper off for any number of reasons in the 90s.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, just the technology alone, like to even think about how to rob a bank today is like unimaginable with all the security measures and surveillance and everything today. But like to think that in the 80s it was the Yankee Bandit who did 64 robberies and just
Yeah,
just kind of walk in there and jump out and jump on the freeway. It was very different.
yeah. The Yankee. So the FBI, back in those days, they wouldn't even pay attention to you until you had hit like 6 or 7 banks, and then they're like, oh, I mean, they were just getting hit 14 times a day. I mean, they got hit 28 times in one day uh, during that time period. But because most of these guys were one-on-one bandits, and they weren't the potential for violence was very low. I mean, they were serious about it. They'd put out, but once they started to get up to that level, they'd give them nicknames because Bill Rader, who ran that department, knew if you could get the media onto something, if you get the media starting to report about it, and hopefully get a photo out there eventually, then you got your chance of somebody spotting it and say, I know who this guy is, and then you
Right.
get your tip and you pick them up. Um, Yankee Bandit was he was named that because he wore a Yankees hat in for the first few baseball cap in for the first few of his bank robberies. So he named him like there was the brown bag bandit. You can imagine what he was wearing. There was the Marx brothers. These guys wore that looked like Harpo Marx masks or hair wigs on. So they had he'd always give them these very clever media ready nicknames. But the Yankee was a guy who I think he was in his probably mid to late 30s at that point. He owned a very successful antique store on Melrose Boulevard that had very high end clientele. I mean, John Lennon, Jack Nicholson, they were all guys coming in. Warren Beatty coming in there, and so he was kind of on that periphery of the brushing elbows with the celebrities and going to the parties and stuff like that. And he developed a vicious cocaine habit, and he started robbing banks. And one day he just, his habit superseded his income flow, and he decided to go in there. And he was what they call an apologist. He would actually say, "I'm sorry, I really hate to be doing." He'd tell the teller, I pass him a note, "I'm sorry to have to do this." But I have a gun and I will kill you. But flash a gun and apologize and get $2,500 and take off. And he started hitting multiple banks. I mean, he hit in a 4-hour period one day. He hit 6 banks.
Man.
Back. Just right up to closing time, and just right along the Wilshire corridor. Drove right past the FBI building on his way to the next.
Wow.
That's
this guy's
stunning.
Productive.
Yeah. But he got up to but the thing is his luck ran out, and and that's how bank robbery is an addiction, and as much as the addiction that was driving him there, because it's and that's Bill Rader again, the FBI head of the robbery bureau, who says it's a it's a real addiction. People start thinking of it as easy money. It's nonviolent. You get out, you're like, wow, now I got $2,500 to get a next score. But their luck eventually runs out, and it's usually because when a cop happens to be driving by, or somebody hits an alarm and a cop responds in 30 seconds before you can get out of there. Somebody takes your license plate number. In the case of the Yankee Bandit, a rather ambitious employee decided to follow him out of the bank and tracked him for blocks along Hollywood and Vine, and until finally got the attention of some cops who took him down. But
wow,
he's 65. He surpassed the brown bag bandit, who had 63 or something like that. So this is a relatively short period of time too.
Mm-hmm. Man, it's crazy. It's not a very sustainable career, I guess.
No. Yeah. You gotta know when to walk out, and very few did, especially if you had a drug addiction. You're you're driven by than good decision making.
Man, well, damn, Peter, this was fun. Seriously, this story is awesome. I find it so fascinating. So, thanks for sharing all this. It was great.
Oh, thanks, Travis. It's been really good. I appreciate it.
Yeah, hell yeah. So if this at all tickled your fancy and you want to get some more, check out your book, Norco 80, the subtitle, The True Story of the Most Spectacular Bank Robbery in American History. And where's the best place for people to grab that?
It's all over. I mean, you never know when you walk in a brick and mortar. In some places it's there, but it's Amazon. There's an audio book. All the places you normally find books is where you're going to find this one.
Sweet. I'll have a link to Amazon for sure, so people can click on that easy and check it out.
Or the one we love is it's called Indie Bound. It's the one that links to your local indie bookseller. We love Amazon. Oh, okay. Don't get me wrong.
Right. No, I get
that's a very cool link too. Indie Bound is one of the things that's keeping these independent bookstores that are so important to the community around. But it basically it's the same functionality, same as Amazon, but it's now your local independent bookstore that's fulfilling the order. So link
that's cool.
As well
as
no,
I didn't know that. yeah, really. That's cool. So Indie Bound, it just tracks your location somehow and then shows where the closest local copy is to you?
No, you actually order it like an online book, like you would from Amazon. They ship it to your house and it arrives.
Oh,
God, boy, I hope I got the name of that right. It's IndieBound. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I'll double check. If it's wrong, look for the link and we'll get it right.
Yeah, no. And yeah, and all that's on my website as well, which
Okay,
yeah, and some good photos of Norco and stuff like that. So,
cool. And what's your website for people?
oh, peterhoulahan.com, HOULAHAN. So,
Gotcha. And I will
yeah.
have links to all that stuff so it's easy for folks to click on that. But that was awesome, Peter. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks. I appreciate it, Travis.
Yep. Have a good one, all right?
Yeah, you too.